So welcome to the last session. My name is Lorenzo Bettini. Work at the University of Florence. I'm a committer for SWTBot, and he's Michael Istria, works for Red Hat and is the project lead of SWTBot. And we just learned yesterday that we can also say SWTBot.
So it's not yet decided.
So we're going to do a brief introduction to this functional testing framework, SWTBot, and some, let's say, some tips for building in a continuous integration system.
Okay. So just before getting started, who of you already knows SWTBot? Okay, who of you don't? Okay, a few ones. So this introduction makes sense. SWTBot, this is the definition on the website, if I remember correctly. It is a Java API which allows to perform UI actions with the API in the grain of the widget interaction. You will see some examples about it. So the value of SWTBot compared to usual testing in Java is that the API is designed to be quite fluent to use and easy to translate from user stories to code. The functional testing, the scope of SWTBot is really to work on the UI logic. So if you have some business logic, some algorithmic things, this is not the scope of SWTBot. The scope of SWTBot is really to have an API when you want to interact with the widgets, with the view, with the UI elements. That's why it's important, because if you use the wrong layer of testing, if you try to use SWTBot where it doesn't make sense, in the end you will have more pain than benefit from it. But so the scope is really to test the UI. And the idea is to have an API which allows you to automate user stories, such as I click on this button, I extended this tree, and I press finish. And then you have functional testing. So you usually test user stories with SWTBot rather than small pieces of UI logic. The application under test SWTBot targets only SWT-based applications. So it may seem obvious to most of you, but we regularly have questions on forum. I want to test swing with SWTBot. No, SWTBot is SWT. If there is no SWT, there is no SWTBot. And it works well for SWT, and as a consequence, it works also pretty well for Eclipse RCP application, which is an Eclipse plugin, of course. What isn't SWTBot? SWTBot is an API, as I said. It is very widely used to do functional tests, as it was introduced, but it is in no way a testing framework. There is no constraint that came with no framework constraint that come with usage of SWTBot. It is really an API, so you can integrate it in JUnit, TestNG, whatever automation framework you use, and you can also integrate it in any test runtime, let's say, so test orchestration runtime, such as PDE test, Tycho, Showfire, or even Maven Showfire if you're doing SWT without RCP. So it is not something that is intrusive in the way you will organize a test. It's just an API.
Okay. So in this talk, we will also talk about some do's and some don'ts with SWTBot. We start with a big don't, and Michael already said something about that. Please don't abuse SWTBot. So it does not replace what you can test with plain JUnit. So before using SWTBot for a specific test context, ask yourself, do I really want to test what the user would do here? Because you have to take into consideration that these kinds of tests takes much longer to execute, okay? We also talk about minutes, or complete integration test suites also many minutes, even hours, okay? And that's not a fault of SWTBot. It's just something implicit in these kinds of frameworks. Also because you have to run an Eclipse application when you run SWTBot. So really, please keep in mind this thing before using that.
The target the target SWTBot user. So since it is an API, the main target are Java developers, mostly SWT developers, because the grain as the API, as you will see, is similar to the grain of SWT. So the main target will be SWT developers, but since SWT is relatively simple and SWTBot also, the target could be any Java developer. So if you have someone, for example, ramping up a new one coming to your team, it's a good way to get started with the Eclipse way of doing things, to have people writing tests with SWTBot. It's a soft introduction. So it targets mainly Java developers and more particularly SWT1. And SWTBot has a recorder and a generator, which we will demonstrate. And the target of this generator is also mostly the developer who will want to bootstrap very quickly a test, a scenario. But it can also be considered to be used directly or not, explicitly or not, by end users. So you could totally imagine that if a user has an issue, he could use SWTBot to record his story and send directly to you the code that can be generated while recording his story. So far it's not the target, it can work, but no one reported using the recorder and generator with end users. But that's something that could work. So if you're interested, worth considering.
We did something like that in my previous company, but with a tester actually, not end user.
So there is one. If you have questions about it, thank you. So that's cool. You should have reported it to SWT.
So, as Mikael said, basically SWTBot provides you with a Java API. Actually, we think it provides a fluent kind of DSL Java API. And the idea is that you have a Java wrapper class for basically any SWT concept. And this wrapper class hides most of the internals of SWT and Eclipse. And in this class, you have methods to simulate user interactions, like select something, click on something, and you can access the widgets in this wrapper. In the end, if you want to start, Content Assist will be your best friend, because it provides a fluent Java API DSL. So let's have a look at how a test in SWT looks like. So you can use any testing framework. You can simply write a pure Java class. If you use this special JUnit runner, what you get for free is that if a test fails, SWTBot automatically records a screenshot of the application while it was failing. And this could be useful in many contexts. Then you have a setup and teardown. You usually declare a bot. You initialize the bot. You can make it static. You can initialize the bot in the before class method. And you can also reset workbench afterwards. And then, you simply use these APIs, this Java API. And for each method, you can consider that SWTBot under the hood generates on the application under test all the SWT events for these methods. So for instance, in this case, we'll see that in more details in the demo, so I'm just going on. You can also access all the workbench, the Eclipse workbench things like views, perspectives, okay? So just accessing the bot, and again, if you use the Content Assist, you can have an idea of what to use depending on what you want to test. So let's see a first demo. So the example I'm going to present here is also available on GitHub, and we will give the link at the end of the session. So here I've basically created two plugin projects using the templates of PDE. So let's see what my application contributes to Eclipse. So I created a simple plugin project with the template for a menu. So my application contributes this menu, sample menu, with a sample command submenu. And if I click on that, I have the dialog with an OK button. In the Java perspective, my application also contributes a sample view. Again, this is the view you get by using the PDE templates, so it's nothing special. The view has a trees with a few children. You can double click on the tree and you get a dialog with a message. You have some context menus on the tree elements. Each menu basically opens a dialog. And we also have two toolbars here that basically do the same. Okay? So let's say I want to test these contributions. I want to test that in the Eclipse, in the application under test, there is a menu with a label sample menu and a menu on a submenu sample command, and if I click on that menu, a dialog will open up with a label and a title, and if I press OK, the dialog closes. So how can I do this in SWTBot? Well, this part basically explained that before. The most important part is this test case. Can you read that? So I want to, sorry?
It seems okay.
I want to test that there is a menu, sample menu, and then another menu, sample command, and I click on that, and if I click on that, I expect that a dialog pops up. A dialog, so in Eclipse it's a shell, in SWT it's a shell. So I expect that there's a dialog with the title example menu. I activate the dialog. I check that there's a label in the dialog. There's a button, OK. I click that, and if I click that, I expect the dialog to close. OK? So even if you never seen an SWTBot, you see that this Java API is pretty readable.
Maybe just
yeah.
addition that we don't have. When we do Bob, Label, and Eclipse work, SWTBot, when we reference an object, test for its existence. So the bot.label is not just getting the label, it is testing that the label exists. This is a test.
Yeah. Yeah, and if it fails, of course, I mean, if there's no such label, the test fails.
Widget not found exception.
So let's run that. We will give more details on how to run an SWTBot test. So you see, it takes some time. Eclipse starts. And it just executed these operations on the menu. We can do the same for the view. In case of the view, I want to, first of all, I want to check that I'm able to open that view. And then I have some tests that basically try to access the tree in the view. So this test tries to expand the tree. So it searches for an element in the tree named root, and it expands that node and tries to find other nodes in the tree, okay? And it tries to select these nodes. There are other tests that, if you remember, in the tree I could double click and a dialog pops up. So again, I want to test that behavior. So I can access an element of the tree and just use the method double click. And then I wait for a dialog to pop up. The same for toolbar button. There is a specific API for accessing toolbar button. So I want to access a toolbar button with that specific tooltip. So I just specify that and then click. Again, if that tooltip does not exist, the test will fail. The same for context menu. So I want to check that an element in the tree has a context menu. You see, this API, this Java API is really, natural. So you just try human readable. You just try with content assist. And so let's run this test. Okay, all the tests succeed. I think that's enough for the demo.
Can you switch?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's a So here you saw APIs for the SWT brain. So when you manipulate a button or a tree, those are SWT widgets. You also saw the API for another brand of Eclipse UI, which is the workbench. So when you use views, we didn't demonstrate perspectives, but perspectives are also available. And there are also APIs for additional items. An interesting one is the Nebula table. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this great widget. Really interesting one. So there is a bot for the Nebula table. So since it's a table, it's mostly about clicking on cells, extending cells. It's very cell-oriented in API. There is one for the SWTBot gallery, so the Nebula gallery, which is a widget to just show images one after the other. So basically, it's previous and next oriented UI API. And a very important piece of SWTBot is that there is an API for JEF, Graphical Editing Framework, which is oriented towards edit parts. So edit parts are the brain of an object in JEF, and you get an API which we won't demonstrate it, that's what we go fast. But the API looks like bot.edit part with the label of the edit part, .move or even delete, and usual operation people do with graphical edit part on an editor. And we mentioned about contributing, but if you have some widget which is very rich and for which the plain SWT approach doesn't match, SWTBot welcomes support for more custom and more business-oriented widgets, as long as you wish to provide nice API for them. A few things to know when writing SWTBot test. One is a UI is mostly about asynchronous operation. When it's not good, but usually, even in Eclipse IDE, a lot of things are asynchronous, so when we click on a menu, there may be some lag between the moment you click and the moment the widget show up, the dialog, for example, in the case of the example. And by default, SWTBot has a timeout strategy, which says, okay, if the widget as requested doesn't arrive within the 5 seconds, I break. However, in many cases, it is better if you have some complex logic, rather than just increasing the timeout without much consideration, or rather than just leaving the thread, hoping that those threads go forward. You have the ability to define your own conditions to make sure that you will wait for the right thing and you will stop waiting when necessary. So here, for example, this example is about making sure that the tree gets populated. So we will wait until the tree has some items, and the length is superior to 0. If you do that, then the test will continue as soon as this condition is true. If you do thread that sleep 20 seconds, then you just waste 20 seconds. And if the tree is ready 1 second, means that for 19 seconds you do nothing. So the sleep approach is one you should avoid when you do asynchronous work, because to do asynchronous means you're waiting for something, and the SWTBot provides the way to define what you're waiting for. So that really speeds up the test and makes them more stable usually to work on wait conditions.
you?
That was mine.
Oh, I think that's mine. Don't. It's okay. so some other don'ts. I think we've seen this code in many parts. For instance, on GitHub. Usually, when you want to run SWTBot tests, you run Eclipse, and the first thing you have to do is to close the welcome view because it's in your way. And typically, I see that many users try to close the welcome view using SWTBot API. So they search for a view with a title welcome, and they close that. The problem is that that view is not always available, so you have to catch the widget not found exception, and in that case, ignore that. Please don't do that, okay? You waste lots of time here. And most of all, closing the welcome view is not part of your functional testing. So if you contribute a view or a menu, closing the welcome view is not part of what you want to test, okay? So you have to close that one so you can use a more programmatic approach and simply scan for the available views, and if that's one that contains whose title is welcome, you close that. That's much faster. There's no timeout here. And again, you don't want to test this. Same for opening a perspective. I forgot to say that the view that I showed you in the demo is part of the Java perspective. So if I want to test my view, I want to make sure that the Java perspective is open. So to set up my test, I have to open the Java perspective. But opening the Java perspective is not part of what I want to test, because I don't contribute the Java perspective. So don't try to open the Java perspective by accessing a menu, okay? Because also, if I remember correctly, these menus typically change from version to versions in Eclipse.
Oh my gosh, no.
So, I mean, it may work on Mars, but it can fail on Neon.
And it also depends on the initial perspective you're using.
Yeah, so that's not part of your test. So don't do it like that. Close it programmatically. Simply use the standard Eclipse API to close that. But please remember that SWTBot tests do not run in the UI thread. So you have to run this programmatic thing in using the sync execution using the display, okay? So this is just a programmatic way, safe programmatic way to, and faster programmatic way to open the Java perspective. So that's part of the setup, but it's not part of what you want to test. And I think this is still mine. Yeah. Please keep in mind that since SWTBot tests run in a non-UI thread, when you run the test, you have to take your hands off the computer. You must not interact with the running application, because otherwise you steal the focus and the test will fail. So that's an inconvenience, but that's typical of functional testing. If you're a Linux user, like us, you can use a nice thing that you can run the tests in another display by using this Zephyr server, and then you run a window manager inside that, like IceVM or MetaCity or Matter, and then you just redirect the display to that other virtual desktop, and you run the SWTBot tests there, and you can continue working.
The reason for that is that internally SWT has one event, at least treats one event queue per display. So if you are on the display and the test is running and you move, then you are adding event into the application you're testing, which is not you want to interact with it. Whereas if it is in another display, then the events you have on your display doesn't affect the events that are processed by SWT on the other display. So this is very convenient, and that's what moving to Linux, in my opinion, and many other things.
One of the many reasons.
Yeah,
To,
exactly.
if I'm not wrong, that's also useful for debugging. Because if you
Yeah.
want to debug an SWTBot test, it's kind of, I mean, if you don't have another display, it's kind of tricky. Because
when you debug, if you're a bit unlucky, there are chances that when you debug, you debug on the UI thread of the application you're testing, which is a mess, so you basically put it in a deadlock state. Whereas if your application is in another display, then since the queue are different, there is no chance of the application interfering, and freezing one application cannot kind of lock the host. So using different display is clearly a good practice.
oh, okay. So it's yours.
Yeah, so execution and automation, as we mentioned earlier, it is just an API, so you can use regular launchers for the test using SWTBot. The only thing to care compared to usual Java test, usual Java plugin test, is that SWTBot generates event in the SWT queue, and it has to run out of the UI thread, because otherwise, if you are generating an event and waiting for the event to be processed in the same thread, then you are in a deadlock. So SWTBot runs in the non-UI thread. So we'll show the wizard in a few minutes in Eclipse. If you're using Tycho, you just want to set this property. It is well documented on the Tycho documentation, on the SWTBot documentation. And if you don't use it, you will likely freeze your test. If you use it, it will just go on naturally. It's just a small thing to remember. And it's actually simple to understand. So SWTBot has a recorder and generator. And I will demonstrate how it works. The idea is that it is the other way around of SWTBot. SWTBot has the API which generates the event. The recorder, on the other end, just monitors the events and tries to get what is the user operation generated by a sequence of SWT event. For example, if you do mouse over, mouse button down, mouse button up, on a widget which is a button, then it is button.click. And that's how SWTBot works. And I will demonstrate it right now. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get back to the test. Which one should I do? So you do file new.
There's a mouse if you want. There's a mouse.
Ah, yeah, the mouse. It's pretty fast mouse. So you do file new test SWTBot, and you have a SWTBot test recorder. Next. Here this one is just candy, I would say. You can try it at home, but it's not worth documenting. The application under test is very useful. Either you can test your current ID if you want, but usually you want to test what you're developing, not your current ID. So you run, this should be checked. You want to run another application, and it opens you the usual launch configuration dialog. So it is the same artifact, it's pretty easy to customize. The only tweak you'll see, it's a secret one, is that you have this flag which is set, and which will enable the generator when the application starts. It's not necessary to and then the target application starts. Here the target application is the one where Enzo showed with the views, the menu and so on. And here you have the recorder dialog. And it's to be, right. You click start recording, and then you start manipulating your application. Okay. And you see in the back that some code was generated from your event. Then you can copy it. No, the other one.
Nope.
How can I retrieve the right one? Can you? I'm not used to. I mean, we can even close the test.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can write a test here, for example. This is the strange arrow.
Italian keyboard.
Test public void, let's call it recorded scenario. And this is.
Yeah.
And then you pass to code here. No.
I think you closed that one.
I close it?
Yeah.
Well, do I? No, I don't have time to redo the demo right now.
You have time. It's the last
Okay.
session.
Well, I can try it again just very quickly if you don't mind. Sorry about it. I mean, repeating is a good way of learning. No, this one. That is it.
It's like a very agile mouse.
Start recording, sample menu, okay. And then get back to the widget.
No. It's out.
I found it by myself. Okay. Copy. Paste. Okay, fine, I have the code. And I will use this story to show you about the fact here I will customize the test I want to run, the SWTBot test. Here it is, JUnit, this one is it. I will want only to run the recorded scenario. And here you see the UI thread is not used by the test. It's important, it's just a reminder. And then you run it and you will see the pop-up and usual stuff. Okay. So this is the recorder engine, which works.
Yeah.
A few caveats about the recorder. A recorder is nice, I mean it's very fancy, it's nice to demonstrate, it's very short and so on. There are some things that are conceptually wrong with a recorder that you need to be aware of before using it. First is the suboptimal addressing. Here it was easy, the menu was the only one with this name, and could use the name and so on. Sometimes you may be in situations where you have a button which has no menu, which has no label, or just you don't want to use the label identifier, you want to use the index or something else. And the difficulty is to identify which widget you're working on, and the recorder may not be very good at it, and may not generate what is the best way to reference a widget. So that's important. Sometimes you have to go and fix and say, no, I don't want actually the button which is name stopped. I want the first button of the dialog, which would be the button 0 base index. So that's the kind of thing you may have to change. Usually using label is the most comfortable way, and that's what is prioritized. So it's usually good. The generic code is pretty basic. There is no factorization, there is no intermediary variables, there are no grouping of methods, it's really just dummy code. We are software developer, we like code to be readable, compact, maintainable, reusable, and that's all. So you very often want to make some refactories based on the generic code. And the generator cannot really know what you're waiting for. So here it was a very simple example. If you have an asynchronous operation you're facing, you need to add the wait condition to make sure that you wait for the right thing before going further. So the recorder is good to bootstrap a test very easily without many skills. And then at some point, if you want it to be a good citizen in your software, you probably have to refactor it. But at least you have a first iteration that good. In CI environments, Here are two examples. This one is Travis, this one is Jenkins or Hudson. It is just about reminding that you need to start the window manager, and then we invoke a regular Maven sync with the Tycho Fire plugin if you're in a SCP world, or with just Java Maven Fire plugin if you're using SWT without Eclipse. Those are documented on the SWTBot. Yeah, you live and on Innovator. You're very welcome to contribute. As I said, it's a relatively easy project and a quite useful one, with I would say a serious user base, happy users moreover, which is not always the case. So if you want to come and contribute, it's really a nice place. Come. There is a good infrastructure with automatic build and submission, so it's also a safe place. Lorenzo, is the definition?
We're running late in time.
Yeah.
The questions?
Yep. Don't feel forced to stay. If you want to move away, we can stay with the people who are
Right?
No, yeah.
You have in the roadmap somewhere planning to create a SWTBot server in which I have a machine that has specific configuration. Because, for instance, for the developer, I don't care about the environment that he uses, but I wanted to test his environment, his code on a specific environment. Do you get sort of the question? Because, for instance, my clients use Windows, but my developers are all to use Linux. We know that Eclipse, for instance, has some dependence related to the GTK to create a browser inside of Eclipse and so on. But I wanted to test its code inside of the Windows environment. So we have in the roadmap some plans. I know that display might be an option.
I'm not sure that it is the scope of SWTBot per se, because what you are thinking is about run test configuration. The issue you're mentioning happens without SWTBot as well. So it would be more a question for the PDE world, maybe. As far as I can tell, unfortunately, there is nothing in PDE roadmap on this topic. However, that's an interesting question, and I think if you want to start discussing it, come on the PDE1, in PDE mailing list, and just say, share your user story, share your ideas, and maybe you will find a few people who have similar things and have something about it. But I don't think SWTBot is the target of your needs.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
He started.
Okay, so when would I use SWTBot and when would I use JUnit plugin tests, which are also a way of bringing up the workbench?
Well, if you manage to split the core parts of your application from the UI, you should be able to test the core parts with plain JUnit. I also gave a talk yesterday at Project Quality Day showing that you can also test many of the things in the UI with plain JUnit. You should use SWTBot if you want to test what the user would do with your application. Okay? So if the user has to click a menu and then something has to appear, you use SWTBot.
Actually, the SWTBot variable is usually called bot. Every time you can replace it with user, it means that you are on the right grain.
But in this context, what is the difference to RCPTT, for example?
So the difference is really a technical difference. RCPTT is a framework.
Yes.
As far as I know, so you have to use the SWTT launchers and so on. Here the idea is to remain on the code level and to be a tool which use these regular Java language, regular JUnit things and so on, without adding a layer of abstraction like SCPTT does. SCPTT is more generic. It has a wider target, I would say. So it introduces some abstraction and some additional features that are not necessary for plain SWT tests when you're testing when you're testing applications with SWT, and if you have knowledge about SWT, when you're testing with SWTBot and have knowledge with SWT, then you feel more comfortable as a Java developer with SWTBot. So it's really a matter of target. SWTT, as far as I understand, I may be wrong, in a while I chatted with them, they really target the job of a QE person who is writing tests as the main artifact. Here the target are not really QE persons, they are developers who write their tests together with their code.
I think the same with Jubula. I think that the same difference with Jubula.
Yeah, I think so.
But I have to add, we did something, well, what I did with the generator that you showed and what I mentioned that we used it is that we had a QA person that he was constantly coming and saying, hey, there is a bug, and then told him, what did you do? And he explained it, we followed it, and we couldn't reproduce it. And since then I told him, I'm not accepting anything if you don't activate that bug, the generator, the recorder first. So he would come to me and say, hey, there's a bug, and I would see more or less what he did, the sequence of his steps. I mean, some would miss, but we were quite happy with him using it, because I could get a feeling of what he actually did, and he didn't have to remember every little thing.
Yeah. By the way, since I mean, you can use any testing framework like JUnit, I think it's also easier to use code coverage tools, because in the end you just run Java code.
I hope it answers your question. It's always those kind of questions comparing tools on the same field are always hard to answer.
Do you have any? Did you have any?
I have a question concerning the GF graphical editing framework. Is only version 3, I guess, right? So there's
GF3, not GF4.
GF3?
As far as I know, GF4 doesn't work.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure, but GF4 has still some backward compatible way.
I think they started from scratch when
And there is no intermediary layer.
No.
So GF4
No,
someone has to contribute it.
But SWT cannot work with J4 because J4 uses Java FX, so there is no possibility actually.
So that's the limit of SWTBot, is that whenever you quit the SWT or dev work, in that case, you don't have anything. So here the idea, if you want to test the JavaFX part in the Eclipse ID, would be to have a bot and to wrap a JavaFX bot and to invoke a JavaFX bot via SWTBot. So you're right, if it's JavaFX, it's almost an entirely different issue.
Just like Swing, it's
Yeah, just like Swing. No support name.
Are there guides to move the mouse relative to a certain widget to test the custom tooltip that should come up? So are there guides for the mouse to position somewhere?
So the grain we show is the widget grain. That under the hood there is some location computation, and you can decide to move mouse to X, Y on the screen. However, it's not very. It makes the test a bit more fragile, a lot more fragile, very fragile. So what?
Yeah, so at the time I used it, the only big limitation that we had was the native dialogues. So my question, so our application would have to load the files from SWTBot couldn't get a handle back on the file, so we were forced to develop a parameter on the application to load the file, to preload the file. So is that limitation addressed or planned to be addressed?
Addressed not, planned to be addressed by, I know that Marc-André and Patrick have already chatted about it. I don't know if they have commitment to fix it.
Okay.
And the idea would be that your native dialogues will be treated as a widget. So you will do bot.file dialog, and you wouldn't interact with the widget inside the file dialog, which are system specific, not controlled by SWT. And you would have control on the dialog such as cancel and select file.
Yeah, I guess most of the use cases just want to get back the file that was selected.
Yeah, so
Because it's not SWT's job to test the native drivers, of course.
Yeah,
It's just whatever file comes back.
yeah.
So that would be quite